Hi, everyone. In this video, we're going to talk a lot about supporting materials, in particular, using supplemental visual aids to bring your presentations to life. We have a ton to cover, so let's not waste any time and dive right in. When you are presenting your speech, it's entirely almost impossible these days to not think about preparing some sort of PowerPoint. Now, hopefully, you have not gotten to the point like this gentleman in the cartoon where you have brought the PowerPoints into the bedroom. But in case you have, let's go through some tips and best practices to make sure that wherever you're presenting your supplemental material, you're doing it the right way. Let's begin instead of talking about material. Let's actually ask a question. And I want everybody right now who's watching, I want you to think to yourself, what are your biggest presentation pet peeves? Okay. What are the things that bother you the most when presenters who are using supplemental media, video, PowerPoints, handouts, whatever it is, right? Whatever is outside of their presentation itself. What's something that drives you crazy? So I want you to just kind of take a look for a second at the options on the slide right here and commit to one, right? So, say to yourself, like, which one is the one that you can't stand the most? So after you've had a chance to do that, I now want you to think to yourself, I'm going to commit to make sure that I will never be the presenter that is guilty of following through on one of those things that drives you absolutely crazy. So I love this technique of trying to think about the things that we like in the world and the things that we enjoy, and then striving to become that person. And then I also like us to identify things that we want to avoid. So when it comes to communication and speaking and presenting, it's really easy for us oftentimes to look out at the examples around us and go, I don't like that. That drives me crazy. So perfect. Okay. If it drives you crazy, it probably drives a lot of other people crazy too. When we look at this list, let's try to do our best to avoid all of these things that are really distracting, frustrating, and certainly not on my list of best practices as we go through this today. So what are presentation aids? Pretty simply, they are there to support you and to assist you during your presentation. They are aids. Now, here's the thing that is really critical about what I'm going to say is that we have become so accustomed, as I already mentioned, to putting together a slide deck or a PowerPoint file, a keynote, whatever you want to call it, that we don't even think about giving the presentation without having one of these to go with it. Even for today's lecture, right? We could be talking about this, but it just seems so natural and normal for us to also have a piece of supplemental media that you can read from or look at. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that it is typically a good thing for any speech that lasts over approximately 5 minutes. So if you are delivering a formal presentation and it is going to be rather long and it's going to have some content in it, go ahead and don't be afraid to use those PowerPoints. I think there's a lot of advantages to them. One of the things I do want to point out, though, is that if you are delivering a relatively short, succinct presentation, maybe at the beginning of a business meeting, maybe you have weekly staff meetings or team meetings on Fridays or Mondays, whenever, and you give a report, please don't be the person who is setting up a PowerPoint, right, for a 60-second or a 2-minute presentation, and it takes you longer to get your technology set up than it does to actually give the report. So there is a bit of a threshold. There's a balance here where they have value. Now, the reason I'm saying I like them for longer speeches is for a couple of reasons, right? One, as speeches get longer, it becomes harder and harder for us to pay attention to the speaker, okay? So now you're providing them an alternative. You're giving them something else to look at. You're giving them something else to read and to engage in. You're also giving yourself a chance to pull their attention back in when you think you might be losing them, right? So if you're giving a 20-minute presentation, you have to imagine you'll have some pretty good attention at the beginning. You'll have some pretty good attention at the end. And then somewhere in the middle, you might be able to use your supplemental material to draw them back in, right? So maybe it's a captivating image, a slide, a graph, right? Maybe you've got a quote on there. Maybe it changes colors, right? Maybe it's video. Maybe it's something dynamic. But if you have something in the middle that kind of pulls them back in, you've now created a mechanism to make sure that they're listening to you from start to finish. And that can be really important. And the last thing is this, is that they're there to support you, right, in the sense that they're meant to tell the stories or show the things that you wouldn't be able to do verbally. So my rule for determining whether or not you should be using certain things in your speeches is that you want to make sure that you're providing clarity. So if you're going to define something like we are right here, right? If you're going to talk about something that could be visually depicted, that's really important. If you want to have an emotional moment, so if you want to startle your audience, if you want to maybe make them a little bit anxious, if you want to make them a little bit scared, if you want to make them a little happy, okay, those are things that you can really do quite well using some supplemental material. So again, they should be used, keywords, supplementally, right, to support what you've already prepared. If you get to the end of preparing your presentation and you think to yourself, this would make for a better video, you may have answered your question. We are now in an era outside of this course where using video and recording content may even be preferred. It's asynchronous. I can consume it when I want to, right? I can edit it. I can add little pieces afterwards. I can cut out my mistakes, etc. Okay. So the idea here outside of this course is that be critical of whether or not doing a live presentation is exactly what the audience wants or needs. And if the materials that you prepared would make for a better video, then go ahead and ask to see if that might be acceptable wherever you're working or for whoever the audience that you're presenting to. Okay, they're there to help with thinking, and as I mentioned right already, they're there to engage the content that you've already put together. Let's talk about some visual design basics, okay? So layouts, all right? So if we look at this slide right here, yes, I'm trying to model best practices, okay? So one of the things that we like about this, right, is that it's relatively clear, it's concise, and it has balance, okay? It has enough, color juxtaposition. We'll talk about that. So this is a good example of a slide that's easy to consume. It's easy on the eyes, relatively speaking. And it also conveys all of the important information that I want to provide to you. And that is that I want your slides and your layouts and your flyers and whatever you're making visually to have these key components be considered. So let's dive right in here for a second and talk about them in a little bit more detail. Let's think about the idea of proximity for a moment. So how we align things, right? So on your word processors, okay? On your Google documents, right? You've got your left alignment, your center alignment, your right alignment, right? And where you organize things on the page, they help to tell the reader, right, where you should start, where you should finish, right? They give us a little bit of a guide. When we look at the imagery here that we have on the slide, right, we begin to tell stories about the relationship between these two individuals that are depicted on this imagery, right? When we look at the left-hand slide, I might ask you, hey, give me a story. What's going on here, right? And so oftentimes when we're doing this in a live lecture hall, or I ask folks about this, students might say to me, I think that is a little boy who has lost his mom, you know, at the grocery store. They're out shopping, and he's trying to catch up to her, right? Now, we don't have any idea who these people are, right? But we begin to infer, because of how close they are kind of the dynamics that are depicted in the visual. Then we look at the right-hand side, we see that picture on the right-hand side, and we think, oh, this looks like maybe a mother and a little boy, and they're walking to school, or they're going somewhere, and they're together, okay? Critically, we know that because of the proximity that they have or don't have in the imagery. Now, I'm using this to make a point, and that is that where you put content in your visual designs has a huge influence on how we, the audience, are gonna go ahead and perceive that content. Now let's take a bit of a look here, right? So we have two exact pieces of the same copy. So word for word, identical on both sides. They both include the exact same bits of information, but we can see the different styles of alignment here that were used, right? So you've got this center alignment on the left-hand side, and there's some good things that draw your eye, right? It kind of pulls you down, but it feels a little bit overwhelming, right? It's just a lot of text, there's a lot of reading, and I can't really quickly extract some of the pieces that are maybe all that important to me if I was interested in going to this particular event. On the right-hand side, we can see that we've gone with center alignment for our headers, but then we've done something that's really interesting, is that we've center aligned the content, but it's left aligned within the center of the page. And for my eyes, at least, that's a little bit easier to see. I also like that we've got bolded headers for each of the three main areas. And then they've created some nice white space, which I really enjoy. It makes it a little bit easier on the eyes to be able to come in and to focus on what's important. So here we see another example, right? Talking about alignment, again, this idea of center versus left. And again, it's got to be intentional. So as we look at flyers and handouts, you see this stuff all the time, right? If you go to doctor's offices, they have flyers everywhere. Chances are all around campus or anywhere that you've gone in your organization, they have all sorts of handouts. And you can see here, right, this is a wellness center. And in this one here, they've got center alignment. Not bad, it's okay, right? And then we come to this one though, and again, we see that everything is left aligned. And again, for my eyes, I prefer this second one because I think it's a little bit easier to read. So again, there is the center alignment, and here we have the left alignment. Now, the point that we're trying to make here is not about just designing flyers. It's that everything in your supplemental materials should be done with intention, all right? So you want to be thinking about whether or not you want it to be center or left. You want to think about where your headers are, where do we want to draw their eyes and their attention, because remember, one of those key characteristics was clarity. And so I want to get to the point where I can convey a lot of information in a short, succinct amount of space or time. And I'm going to do that by taking advantage of some characteristics like proximity. Let's talk about another characteristic that I want you to take advantage of. And this is this idea of contrast, all right? So one of the things that I want you thinking about is how can you use light? How can you use color? How can you use space to create contrast, to make the visual more dynamic, to make it more interesting, more engaging? But again, also going back to that concept of clarity, making it easier for the audience to consume this imagery. Now, one of the things that you see here on the slide is that we're using a black backdrop with white text over the top. And for the most part, all of our monitors and our screens now have really been positioned in a way where those dark features, those dark themes are a little bit easier for us to read in most cases. Now, some of you may have preferences and maybe some of you don't like that particular mode, but we've seen a huge shift in a lot of the operating systems relying on this. The one thing I'll say is that if you are presenting in a live room, all right, and especially this can be really actually problematic. Most of your presentations typically will be during the day, and sometimes you'll have the luxury of presenting in a room with lots of windows and natural light, and that's great and beautiful until you're working with a relatively older projector and you've got your content up on the screen and you've got a white backdrop, and potentially you've got a scenario where you've got a lot of natural light getting thrown up against that projector screen, and now all of a sudden you have no contrast, right? Your content is really hard to see. So for a variety of reasons, I'm suggesting that going with darker backdrops looks a lot better, and then going with lighter text over the top can create greater contrast. It's easy to read, and it helps you in that scenario. And I've been in that scenario, and I've been on both sides of it. And it really can help to make sure that your audience can see what you're putting up. There's nothing worse than somebody putting up a set of slides and you can't read what's on them. The font's too small. There's no contrast, right? So we want to avoid that. So something to think about there. Here's some examples, right? Left-hand side, we have a light colored background with dark text over the top. On the right-hand side, we have the dark colored background with the light text over the top. Again, you may have a particular preference here, but one of the things that you might notice is that on your screen, specifically as those screens get smaller too. So if you happen to be watching on your phone right now, you're going to notice that the image on the right-hand side typically a lot easier to read. We see it in advertising. Mad Men, a very meta example here, a show about advertising. Here's an advertisement for the show about advertising. If you've ever seen the show, if you haven't, check it out. Mad Men love to play with color and imagery and style and contrast in the show. And then, of course, it came through in their marketing. And again, another example here, very dynamic, relying on color juxtaposition just to really pull you in, to create contrast, to make it interesting. And that is certainly something that some of you might use as a style, right? So this can become very stylistic for you. And it's something that you can see was successful for, marketing and producers of that show. All right, let's change gears a little bit, right? Let's talk about some other types of presentation aids that might be relatively useful to you. So you have things like props, you have models, you have maps, charts, and you also, of course, have video. And we're going to talk about all of these right now and dive into some specifics about them. So let's talk about this idea of how we could use some props effectively. So one of the things that you want to do is figure out exactly what prop you want to use, right? And then you have to identify when you need to bring it into the scene, right? And then from there, you may, of course, want to make sure that you are comfortable using it and holding it, and that, of course, the audience can see it, and that you are allowing them to receive it in a way. Now, you might notice something else going on here on the slide. I am using the reveal feature for these particular notes, and I'm doing so with particular purpose. I will tell you that it's my professional opinion that using those reveals are really distracting. All right, they're distracting to you as a presenter, and they oftentimes are pretty distracting to you, the audience. So I include them here as the example of saying, what would the difference have been if I had just portrayed all of that information when the slide had changed and not had done that reveal function? And I would say it would have absolutely have not made a difference. In fact, if anything, it would have allowed me to focus more on the content I was presenting and allowed you to start reading through some of that content a little bit quicker. Now, we will say, if you actually have a reveal, a surprise moment, a thing that you wanted to showcase to your audience in some particular manner with a reveal, then go ahead and use it. But you see a lot of times where amateur presenters, they're revealing each single bit of their slide, and it just becomes ultimately really distracting. Now, coming back to using props effectively, you see here an example of champagne flutes. And for many of you, your champagne flute at a wedding or at a party, a celebration, will be one of the first props that you might use in your adult professional speaking career, right? And you'll take maybe a champagne flute or a glass or something with you to the head table or to the front of the room, and you're going to deliver a toast. One of the things that we want to remind everybody is that if you're going to utilize any type of prop, you have to think about how you're going to integrate it, right? So it can't just be this thing that's next to you. If it truly is a prop, then it has to be in some way integrated. So something as simple as saying, I'd like everybody to raise their glass. And at that point, see, I have my mug up here. I raise my glass, right, to actually toast the bride and groom or whoever it is, right, that's celebrating. You can do that, and that's a great integration of that particular prop. But one of the things that we want to avoid is a scenario where you're presenting, you take this prop out and you put it on the desk, or you put it next to you, you have it in your hand, and you never acknowledge it. It's going to be quite distracting, and it really just doesn't show that you've graduated to that professional level of being able to integrate items while you're speaking. Now, do make sure that you're practicing with your prop, because on the day of delivery, you can be a little bit nervous. In fact, I've seen at many weddings, folks to get up and give speeches, and they get up to the front of the room and they've forgotten to bring their glasses, they forgot to bring their speech, and they forgot to bring their toasting glass. They went, I'd love for everybody to raise their glass, and they're looking around and awkwardly, like they're grabbing one from the table. I've even seen one where this poor fellow actually tried to take the bride's champagne flute, and that got really awkward because she was like, you just took mine, so I'm not toasting to myself anymore. This just got weird, and it was pretty awkward. So make sure that you're practicing with your prop and you feel comfortable when you're using it. Okay, so keeping things moving here, you've got diagrams and maps. What's the most important part of a map? In my opinion, it's making sure that it's relative to the audience, right? So the first thing that I'm going to probably ask in many ways, if you're going to show me a map, is I'm going to say, where am I, right? So I want to be relative to what you're showing me. So that might require two maps, right? So you might have a zoomed out map and say, hey, we're here in Connecticut, or here we are in this particular location. Here's where we are in the building. And then you may want to then go ahead and zoom in or zoom out from there to be able to put it into greater perspective. But make sure that I feel like as an audience member, I'm looking at a map and I have some relative context of where this is. Think about this for a moment, right? If I were to kind of tell you about an island, and I were to just zoom in with a map and it was just the island, right? And I couldn't see contextually like maybe what ocean or body of water it is, what countries or continents it was next to, I'd be probably struggling the entire time if I didn't know where the island was, being like, I don't really know, is this in the Atlantic? Is this in the Pacific? Is this warm? Is this cold? Like, I don't know anything about this. So providing perspective with your map usage is really important. All right, all sorts of different types of pie charts and graphs, and they're great because you can provide a lot of information in a simple manner. Here's the deal. You got to make sure you're picking the right one. So this is really just about making sure, recognize that there are different types of charts and graphs and use them accordingly. If you're not sure, do a search, ask somebody, try it a couple different ways and see which one ultimately makes the most sense. We start with pie charts. Pie charts are going to be parts of a whole. So if you're looking at something that has a full percentage, right? So if you have a whole number, okay, so if you wanted to talk about, the population of where students are from, right? What country, what state they're from, right? If you wanted to talk about the potential breakdown of some particular demographic within a given population, that would be parts of a whole, right? You cannot use a pie chart for a number that is not fully identified, right? So if we're thinking about, future growth, right, and where future growth is going to come from, well, that number, that particular number is an absolute number. So having that be a part of a whole is not possible. So if you're thinking about percentage breakdowns, right, where you spend your money, right? So if you spent $500 a month for the last 12 months and you wanted to go, okay, where am I spending my money? Mostly on food, on entertainment, on dining, going out, transportation, insurance, whatever, that would be a part of a whole. If you were talking about where you're going to spend your money in the future, right, that could be a little bit harder to portray in this way because that number hasn't been created yet. It's not a finite number, unless, of course, you were maybe thinking about making a budget, and that would of course be relatively appropriate, but you'd have to be clear that that was an approximate or predicted number, that that wasn't based on something that existed. Okay, moving on to the next step, we got bar graphs. I love bar graphs, right? One of the things that they're doing is they're giving you an X and Y axis. Now you have 2 points of data, right? You have the opportunity to compare X on Y, and you can see here color coding the bar graphs is a great way to demonstrate lots of data. These are great pieces where maybe you're comparing things that are similar but not the same. Maybe you want to compare revenue growth within organizations. Maybe you want to compare, maybe you've got 5 or 6 stocks that you've been following, and you're tracking their price potentially, and you wanted to see how they did from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. That could be certainly a way to do it. You want to demonstrate something with volume, right? So how many votes were particularly received or cast for a certain candidate. This would be a potential way to do that. Line graphs, kind of an extension of that, allow you to now begin inferring time. So you begin to see here that you get to have the X and Y axis, but now you're also offering this concept of time. So we begin to see trends and changes. I mentioned this earlier, but like stock markets, right? So if you're following stocks, this is one of the most common ways that you're going to see a particular stock being portrayed. And you can look at it over a day, a month, a week, a year, or all time. And so one of the things that can be really helpful here is that it provides us some perspective. Now, again, you can see at the bottom here on the X and Y axis, on the bottom it says day. That's a really important piece of information, right? Because if we don't have that, we maybe don't have the ability to infer that this is not all time on Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, that this is potentially a day. And you might want to go a step further, might want to say like what week that was from, right? So if you actually were to label the week as saying, you know, this was January 1st to January 7th of, 2018, this is what the weather looked like. Giving us those inferences of time become very important. Timelines are great. Here you have the good old classic Nintendo Entertainment System from 1984, and you could kind of follow it up to 2005. And so if you were doing a study on how the Nintendo changed maybe over its first 20 years or so, this would be a great way to do it, right? Then you could have another timeline to show how the Nintendo changed over the next 20 years or so. So again, you're providing the chronological ordering of something. We talked about props earlier, but I just do want to make sure that we come back and hit this one time, is making sure that you understand that you're going to know how to integrate it into the speech and ultimately, where to put it, right? And so that is just so important that you do that. Okay, finally, and I did want to get to this, some tips for video. If you're going to integrate video content into your speech, it needs to be used incredibly sparingly. So my general guideline is that it should never be more than 10% of a live speech delivery. And in fact, I'm suggesting that you should almost never use video content for a virtual asynchronous speech. So if you're recording your speech and you're submitting it, there really is no space for video in such a delivery. If you're delivering a live presentation, I'm giving you a guideline of approximately 10%, right? So you could kind of think about a 5-minute speech as I have here. Approximately 30 seconds of the speech could be dedicated to an alternative source. So it could be a video, it could be an audio file, it could be maybe a quote, it could be something of that nature. But again, you're delivering a presentation, so you need to be the focal point of the audience's attention. And so by pulling them to something that they could watch asynchronously on their own, that you could send to them, that you could use it a follow-up, those are things that I really think you can avoid. All right, so let's kind of bring this thing to a close. One final thing that I do want to address that's really important when it comes to supplemental materials is thinking about handouts, okay? So in years past, right, we would see, presenters using handouts, pieces of papers. They might pass out their slides. They might hand them out at the beginning or the middle, at the end. One of the things that I just kind of want to draw to your attention for those of you heading into, business-like careers, you're making pitches and presentations, and potentially you're doing them in shared rooms. One of the things that you might consider is that it can be hard, especially in moderate-sized rooms, to create meaningful follow-ups. And what I mean by this, if you're in a relatively small room, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, your ability to connect after the presentation or meeting is usually pretty good. If you're in a room with maybe more than 25 people, you might have a chance to connect with a few people, but probably not everybody in the room. But when you get to those moderate-sized rooms, right, you're making presentations from 6 to 15 people, we'll say. One of the things you can consider doing is you could use a post-presentation handout as a way to get some follow-up, right? So one of the things that you might think about doing is that you're using that handout as a way to get your business information, your contact information into their hands. You're giving them something tangible as they're walking out. And maybe you want to put your LinkedIn profile link on there. Maybe you want to put your email address, your phone number, whatever it is that you want them to do, whatever your call to action is. Don't give it to them potentially during the presentation, right? You want them paying attention to you, but instead potentially use it as a mechanism to say, hey, thanks for coming. Here's my information. Would love to follow up if you have any questions. Now, even if not everybody is taking it and doing it, you've increased your chances that somebody who enjoyed your presentation might actually take that thing, slip it in their bag, walk out, go home that evening and go, oh yeah, that actually was pretty good. I'm going to follow up and connect with this person on social media. The other thing that I want to talk about at handouts is this: presenting, giving handouts during the presentation is almost always a bad idea, right? So if we are 5 minutes into a 50-minute presentation and I start walking around the room and start handing things out, there's a good chance I've not only disrupted your focus and attention, but I have completely detracted away from the show, from the performance that we've put together, with one potential exception, right? If you ever found yourself kind of presenting materials that you were potentially struggling with, or you're on a team presentation, right? Or you're in a scenario where you know that there's some potential uncertainties and you would like to use that as a moment to break. So maybe you're presenting some data, some numbers, some figures, some concepts that you're not all that comfortable with. Maybe somebody from the team didn't show up that day, right? You can at times think about using that handout mechanism in the speech as a way to kind of break up the speech itself. Now, we're not talking about formal keynote speeches or the types of speeches that we're doing in a public speaking course. We're talking about, business presentations where you're pitching something potentially, and maybe you want to use that as a moment to take a break in the action and to kind of say, hey, let me pass around some things here so that we can get a little bit more accustomed and comfortable with the content we're talking about. So at the end of the day, you want to be intentional with your supplemental media. That was the most important thing that we taught about. We want to make sure that we're having a diversity of our content whenever we possibly can. And then finally, use those best practices of design. So whether it's your handouts, your flyers, your business card, your PowerPoint presentation, doesn't matter. Think about the best practices that we talked about today. Think about the importance of being concise and having clarity, the juxtaposition and all of those things. And hopefully this will help put you in a good position with whatever types of materials that you'll be preparing in the future.